every interview I do, when people say, "Are you still clean?" The whole article winds up being about drugs.
Aerosmith were born from an obsessive love of the rock music that developed out of the British pop music of the 1960s and the blues boom that followed it. From the early years of the 1970s to the present day, they have maintained the strength that has been gained from a tireless commitment to their art, while at the same time they are a living testament to the weakness of addiction and the havoc it wreaks on lives. At a time when the band were formed, the world of rock music was still reeling from the catastrophic deaths of three of its most vital performers, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison. All fell victim to the pressures of performing and died from the effects of the drugs that were part of the rock and roll lifestyle. Aerosmith's heroes were the guitar slingers of the previous generation, Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page, both of whom had begun their careers in the Yardbirds, as well as pop bands such as the Kinks, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Aerosmith's hybrid meshing of the sleazy glamour of the Stones and the high camp of the New York Dolls was an irresistible formula, and with their song Dream On, they established the template for the power ballads that would become a staple of arena rock bands the world over. But at one point they had almost driven themselves to the brink of collapse in their tireless crusade to keep alive the spirit of no-nonsense, heads-down rock and roll. Their battles with formidable personal demons in turn had threatened their survival, and there was a lost weekend during which their reckless taste for drugs, cars, guns and more drugs proved that even the mightiest can fall, and fall hard. True to the spirit of the great rock spectacle, Aerosmith nosedived out of control, crashed and burned. But out of the ashes, their considerable resilience and personal strength prevailed. They returned to fight further, longer and harder than any of their generation. By the mid-1980s, they had pulled off a remarkable comeback, eclipsing the popularity they had achieved a decade earlier. During the 1990s, they had acquired mythic status, and they now look set to continue their distinguished career well into the new century. Ladies and gentlemen, Aerosmith, the greatest rock band in the world.
And all the stuff that Jimmy Page did before Led Zeppelin, the Yardbirds, and all the people that were coming out of England around that time and before, like Cream and Jimi Hendrix. Those people to me are the heroes that took the blues and turned it into this hugely popular style.
In 1965, when Stephen Tallarico's high school band, the Strangers, played their local Hopetown venue in support of the legendary psychedelic folk rock band The Byrds, they were emphatically forbidden to cover any of the group's songs. But the warning was ignored and Stephen stormed on stage, powering into a rendition of 8 Miles High. The Byrds themselves, watching from the wings, were impressed. As the Strangers band came off stage 6 songs later, Roger McGuinn, frontman of the Byrds, congratulated Stephen. "Nice show, man." Stephen Tallarico was born in New York on March 26, 1948. At this time, his family were living near the Apollo Theatre in Harlem. As a young child, he was taken each summer to New Hampshire, to Lake Sunapee, where between June and September he would lose himself in the woods around Trorico, the Tallaricos' summer home. Music was in the blood. At the turn of the 20th century, Stephen's grandfather, Giovanni Tallarico, had emigrated with his 3 brothers from Calabria in Italy to New York, where they formed a quartet and became professional classical musicians. The tradition ran through the generations, and as a young child, Stephen would sit each day beneath his father's piano at their home in Yonkers, a rural suburb of New York, and listen while his father practiced, literally immersing himself in the music. Stephen, with his friend Ray Tabano, was in a gang called the Green Mountain Boys, but he was never a gang tough, preferring animals and underdogs, championing the dispossessed. Ray, on the other hand, was aggressive and physically powerful. By the age of 15, Stephen had started drumming with his father's dance band, but the music they played was lame and he knew that it was not going to get him far in his frantic quest for immortality. In May 1965, he experienced a religious conversion when he saw the Rolling Stones play in New York. Then, as now, he was compared physically to Mick Jagger. The Stones became an early role model. Jagger with his leery pout and snake-hipped dancing, Keith Richards with his king of cool stage presence and loose but tight rhythm playing. This was it. 1965 was also the year that Stephen first encountered two of the people who would later play a key role in his life. One evening, whilst hanging out with friends at a fast food parlour at Lake Sunapee, he was so impressed with the French fries he was eating that he went down to the kitchen to see who was making them. A skinny kid with his hair over his face glowered back at him. Stephen's friends had been loud and obnoxious, and the food they threw around would be left for him to clean up. The French fry chef went by the name of Joe Perry. The second important individual was a boy in his early teens, whose father had taken away his drums on the ground that he lacked the talent to play them, and he came to Stephen to ask to borrow his. This was Joey Kramer, drummer for another local band, the King Bees. Joey later became Aerosmith's powerhouse Styxman and remains so to this day. Following the success of their first gig with the Byrds, Stephen's band auditioned for Date Records, a subsidiary of CBS, and were signed for a $6,000 advance. But the name they used was already taken by another group, and so they became The Chain Reaction, scoring a minor hit in Europe with their single The Sun, produced by Richard Gotterer, the famed producer of the McCoys' hit Hang On Sloopy. But pressures on the band to split saw The Chain Reaction dissolve, and Stephen formed a new band, The Chain. They could see that to make it in New York would involve one rough ride too many, and so they moved down to Boston, a town not noted for its rock and roll attitudes. The barn was the top local venue at Lake Sunapee, and so, during a visit back home in the summer of 1967, shortly after the Woodstock Festival, Stephen and his friend Zunk Booker dropped in to see who was playing. Up on stage came a three-piece outfit, the Jam Band. From the word go, Stephen was transfixed. They played a hybrid mix of Jeff Beck, Hendrix, the MC5 and the original blues-based Fleetwood Mac. By the end, Stephen, Zunk and a young girl named Alyssa Jarrett were dancing with the rest at the front of the stage, and it was then that Stephen realised that he wanted the Jam Band. They had to be his band.
But Aerosmith cut their teeth on playing live. To get known and seen, we had to get on a bus and hitchhike and rent cars and play wherever we fucking could, and all over the United States.
The guitarist and bass player of the Jam Band were two young musicians named Joe Perry and Tom Hamilton. Perry was born on the 10th of September 1950 in Boston, Massachusetts, growing up in Hopedale, the former company town of the Draper Corporation, a textiles company with 3,000 employees. Hopedale was originally established as a small-town utopia, a place where the timeless American values of courtesy, respectability and neighbourliness still prevailed. Depending on what kind of place you think America really is, Hopedale either is or isn't the kind of town you'd expect to produce a rock and roll bad boy like Joe Perry. He grew up to idolise the kings and princes of the London music scene of the mid-60s, The Who, The Kinks, The Yardbirds, The Rolling Stones and Jimi Hendrix. The train kept rolling, one of the defining moments of rock music, as sexual innuendo was a staple of the Yardbirds' live set, and one of the songs which defined the early approach of Led Zeppelin, the undisputed godfathers of arena rock. Aerosmith still play that song in their own live set today. A marked lack of interest in school and a keen interest, almost an obsession with the guitar, led Joe to various small bands, one of which his friend Tom Hamilton played in. Tom was born on December 31st, 1951 in Colorado Springs. Brought up on a mix of the Ventures, the Beatles and Californian comics such as Zap and the Furry Freak Brothers, he learned about music from his parents, whose hi-fi was always banging out the hits of the day, and from his guitarist brother Scott. Although potentially an academic, Tom discovered acid while in school and began to find studying boring. He learned to master the bass by playing along to the Rolling Stones records and joined local band Sam Citrus and the Merciless Tangerine, who already had 2 guitarists but needed a bass player. A year later was when he met up with Joe Perry, and they played in an outfit they later named the Jam Band, and in September 1970 they both moved together to Boston. It was only 3 days later that Jimi Hendrix died, and a week after that Janis Joplin passed away. The Beatles had split 5 months earlier, and popular music was undergoing a radical change. Vice President Spiro Agnew would soon give his famous speech in which he asserted that American youth were being brainwashed into a drug culture by rock music, movies, books and underground newspapers. It was under the influence of all these changes that the fledgling Aerosmith was hatching. Stephen, who had now dropped his family name, Tallarico, in favour of the snappier Tyler, Joe Perry and Tom Hamilton got together and formed a band, with Stephen's childhood friend from the Green Mountain Boys, Ray Tabano, on second guitar, and Joey Kramer on drums. Joey was born into a Jewish family in the Bronx in New York on June 21, 1950. He discovered the drums at an early age and found that he could work out of his system the anger that he felt when his father hit him. During his teenage years, other kids would have a Playboy centerfold on the wall of their room. Joey, however, would pin up a 2-page spread of the Ludwig drums he lusted for. Later, he drummed for the King Bees, a formative version of the Dantes, one of Steven Tyler's early bands. Joey knew Stephen and Ray Tabano from high school. After the King Bees, he had joined a group formed by a local singer called Frankie Ray. After 3 weeks at Berklee College of Music in Boston, Joey became bored with the disciplinarian approach and left. Not long after that, he auditioned at Ray Tabano's suggestion for Joe and Stephen's new band. Joe stood behind him while he played, nodding and smiling, and needless to say, Joey got the gig. For the next 2 years, Stephen, Joe, Tom and Joey lived in a squalid apartment at 1325 Commonwealth Avenue in the campus town of Brighton in Boston. When they were discussing the new name, Joey suggested Aerosmith, a name he had previously suggested, but which the others had rejected. This time, the rest of the group decided they would go with it. Now, under Stephen's demanding leadership, they set to work to hone their writing and playing skills. Their first gigs concentrated heavily on the diet of British blues rock they had all grown up with, but they soon found that it was too heavy for local audiences who wanted jukebox hits that they could dance to. There was prejudice too amongst music industry insiders who could only see the resemblance between Steven Tyler and Mick Jagger. They thought that any band trying to get a life in Boston was doomed from the start and wrote them off as substandard Rolling Stones lookalikes. But Aerosmith knew who they wanted to be, and playing cute pop hits was not an option. Already at this early stage, they were having enough troubles inside the band, with Ray Tabano, an aggressive streetwise kid who liked to use his fists to settle arguments, proving too heavy for the others. After a spectacular argument with Stephen, Ray was out. It was 1971 and Aerosmith needed a new guitarist.
you know, I feel strong about every album we make. You know, when it's done, I put it on and I play it, and I think it's going to be our biggest album ever.
The guitarist came in the shape of Brad Whitford. Brad was born on February the 23rd, 1952 in Reading, Massachusetts, a suburban town north of Boston. Whilst in high school, he learned to play the trumpet, but gave it up because the teacher had a habit of hitting him on the head with a drum mallet if he made a mistake. His first love had always been the guitar, which he learned to play at a local music store. He then took lessons for a year and practiced himself by playing along to records. Brad proved to be a natural, soon far outstripping the abilities of his teachers. Finally, in 1971, when he was playing in a local band in and around Lake Sunapee, Joe Perry and Tom Hamilton came to check out the great young guitarist whom they'd heard about from a mutual musician friend. Not long after, Joe asked Brad if he wanted to join Aerosmith. Having accepted, he turned up at the band's apartment at 1325 Commonwealth Avenue and was given a quick taste of their lifestyle when Stephen met him at the door carrying a large Coke spoon. A chance call to stand in for rock heavyweights of the day Cactus and a bizarre audition in a dark, cold, empty cinema for an unseen figure smoking a cigar earned Aerosmith a manager, a Boston Irishman called Frank Connolly. Uncle Frank, as he became known, sharpened up their stage act and eventually secured a contract for Aerosmith with Steve Lieber and David Krebs, who managed the band for the next 12 years. Failed attempts to sign the band to Atlantic, who managed Led Zeppelin in America along with the Rolling Stones and many highly regarded jazz and soul acts, led them to approach the next in the pecking order, Columbia Records. Known as CBS in Britain, they had flirted at the end of the 60s with the new psychedelic and progressive bands, but by 1972 had avoided hard rock in favour of such easy-listening stars as Barbra Streisand, Andy Williams and Paul Simon, none of which were exactly at the cutting edge of the new music. Nonetheless, Columbia's A&R chief, Clive Davis, signed them for a significant advance and a 2-album-per-year deal, and they were, in theory, up and running. Work began on the first album. They had already written most of the songs, including such early classics as Mama Kin, later covered by Aerosmith devotees Guns N' Roses, and the prototype power ballad Dream On. Steven Tyler delved into his experience as a child when he sat for hours under his father's piano to bring a classical influence to the band's repertoire. David Krebs saw in Steven a natural star. He could sing, write, play half a dozen instruments and had his own carefully defined style with the makeup, the camp glamour and scarves draped over his microphone. Everyone around Steven at that time knew not only that Aerosmith would be huge, but that they had, in Steven Tyler, a genius for a frontman. It was during the recording of their first album for Columbia that Joe Perry started dating the beautiful young woman who he knew from Lake Sunapee, Alyssa Jarrett. However, their relationship would drive a wedge between Joe and the other band members, as Alyssa seemed to claim Joe for herself exclusively. According to other members of the band, she shopped for his clothes, dictated where and when he could go, and liked to believe that she was possessed of greater style and class than the rest. Of course, this was just the inevitable friction that follows when young men begin to pair off with their female partners, breaking the bonds that tie them to the gang mentality of an all-male group. But for Aerosmith, it was her timing that was seen to be unfortunate, coming as it did when they needed to be focused on their burgeoning career. It was indicative of the pressures that would later divide them. But that would be later. For now, they were absorbed in the task of becoming what they all knew they could be: America's greatest rock band.
We're given the spotlight, so we stepped right into it. We had a good album. Aerosmith is a fucking great band to see live.
Aerosmith had constantly hyped themselves up for the moment they would begin work on their first album. Now, having got there, they found they were unable to get down on tape the music that they knew they were capable of producing. When they played the 8 songs they eventually completed to Columbia Records, the company announced they felt there was no possible hit single to put out. They then found that the company was distracted by the excitement caused by a new signing who went by the name of Bruce Springsteen. So when the first album, simply titled Aerosmith, was released in January 1973, it was in the same week as the debut of this bright new star, and they found themselves overshadowed. Discussing the album in an interview, Steven Tyler said he thought the record was underproduced and that his own singing was unrepresentative of his style. Aerosmith had recorded their first album before they were ready. But as a live act, they continued to amaze, and their fan base was growing accordingly. The sleeve notes on the first album had described their music as being for the young and the young in the head and anybody who can still take it raw. So now they took it out there to those who could still take it raw, and of course that meant a lot of people. Just because Columbia thought that every act on their label should fit with their earnest image of how a rock entertainer should be, start with Bob Dylan and work from there, it didn't necessarily mean that young kids without a scene of their own saw it the same way. They wanted a band that reflected their own preoccupations: sex, breaking away from home, and more sex, and all served up with that manic energy that threatens to drive you off the edge of the world. Next, they took their show further afield, down to the Midwest heartlands of Detroit, where a local station had them on heavy rotation. This, according to Steve Lieber and David Krebs, was the way forward. They had decided not to be discouraged by the fact that the world had ignored their first album and got down to the business of writing the second. This would be called Get Your Wings and would define the Aerosmith image with its Harley-Davidson style and heavy black encircled capital A. But despite their growing following in the working-class car factory towns of the Midwest, Columbia had decided not to renew their option. David Krebs, desperate to hold on to what he believed to be a great chance for them all, bullied a top executive at Columbia into allowing Aerosmith more time to prove themselves. It hadn't been done before, but it worked. Their first national review came from the Detroit-based music magazine Cream, and then word slowly began to spread. And so, just when it seemed they would be grounded for good, the radio stations started to play Dream On and the ball was rolling. With the extension to their contract in place, they went out on the road and gave the world no option but to take them into its heart. And so began their determined slog to the top.
When Toys in the Attic came out, or when we were recording that, I had written the arrangement for Sweet Emotion. And that song went to become one of our biggest songs. So it's kind of my responsibility to make sure that even if I think one of my ideas might not be exactly right, I've got to make sure that I show it to people.
But it was 3 years after it was released before Dream On would finally reach the top 20 as a single. In the meantime, the band had to live with it as their soft rock anthem, which Joe Perry found particularly difficult, as it neither stood for what Aerosmith were truly about, nor showcased their playing at its best. But better to be known for Dream On than not at all. 10 months after the release of their first album, it entered the lower reaches of the Billboard chart at number 166. So it was a start. For the next record, they brought in producer Jack Douglas, a veteran engineer who'd worked with the hard rock outfit Mountain, Miles Davis, and The Who on their blockbuster album Who's Next. Together they began to construct the true Aerosmith sound in the studio. With their single beginning to make waves, they were booked into the record plant in New York, a daunting prospect for a band that still had so much to learn. But when Jack Douglas first saw them in a crowded club in Boston, they won him over immediately. This was what they needed, someone with real experience who was on their side. Get Your Wings came out in March 1974. Columbia repeated their trick of releasing an album by Bruce Springsteen at the same time. But now at least they were prepared to put some promotional weight behind Aerosmith's work and released Same Old Song and Dance as the first single. But the best promotional tool was the band themselves, touring until they dropped to force the record to sell because before MTV there was no surer way to raise your profile. And it worked. A year after its release, Get Your Wings had sold over 500,000 copies and became their first gold record. In 1974, rock seemed to be falling apart. The New York Dolls had failed to realise their potential and spent most of their time bombed out of their heads and unable to tune their guitars. Kiss was threatening to take over the world with their circus act of spandex tights, face paint and loud explosions. Fleetwood Mac would shortly confound their own legend with their soft rock classic Rumours, as if Peter Green had never existed, and disco was working its way out of the gay clubs to become a global phenomenon. So what did all this have to do with rock and roll? And more importantly, at least to the 5 members of the band, what did all this have to do with Aerosmith? Fortunately, there are enough real rock bands out there to keep the fires lit for a while yet. Aerosmith opened for them all. Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Blue Oyster Cult, Argent, Santana, the outgoing New York Dolls and the incoming Kiss. Early in 1975, Tom Hamilton married Terry Cohen, the girl he had been dating since he first joined the band. They were now making more money, the drugs were getting better and their egos bigger. The Aerosmith train had long since left the station and was rolling into the big-time world of after-gig parties, hotel room demolition and whatever else it took to be truly rock and roll. They now had access to top-quality Peruvian cocaine, which they took to with considerable enthusiasm, banishing their natural shyness and polishing the shine on their egos to perfection. And to further compound their bad boy image and to add his own weight to the girlfriend as potential controversy issue, Steven Tyler had begun to date a 14-year-old girl named Diana, who, much to everyone's amazement, was given a written deposition from her parents, making Steven her legal guardian. But they had to get back to the studio, and the sessions for Toys in the Attic began in January 1975. With 2 years solid touring behind them, they were now in full command of their talents. And from the sessions would come the song for which many people defines Aerosmith as a world-class act. Walk This Way, with its swaggering guitar riff, its fatback funk and roll rhythm section, with Joey Kramer holding down a funky backbeat that owed more to James Brown than British rock music, defined a moment in time. 1975 was the last time that the British rock bands that had given Aerosmith such potent inspiration would walk the earth as kings. Led Zeppelin would, after Physical Graffiti, begin their slow, sad decline. Thin Lizzy suffered the loss of their charismatic leader Phil Lynott to a heroin overdose, and The Who, after the release the year before of By Numbers, were beginning to fade in strength, long before Keith Moon's death signalled the bitter end of a glorious era. But the flag of raw power still flew high over Aerosmith wherever they played. They were now acquiring a reputation, and with that came the pressure to prove that they were fit for the job. Back at the record plant, with Jack Douglas again producing, they recorded a killer album, one that would go gold soon after its release in April. Augmented with horns from the renowned Brecker brothers, session men to the Stars, and boogie-woogie piano from veteran player Scott Kushney to bring that authentic down-home R&B feel to big 10-inch record, these were their most polished recordings to date. Toys in the Attic also saw Tom Hamilton provide the basic idea for Sweet Emotion, Brad Whitford co-writing Round and Round with Steven Tyler, and a collaboration with Don Solomon from Tyler's Chain Reaction days, You See Me Crying. Shortly after the release of Toys in the Attic, Frank Connolly became ill with cancer and sold his interest in Aerosmith to Steve Lieber and David Krebs. Events were now moving so quickly, the band could barely keep up with them. They bought a rehearsal space called The Warehouse at 55 Pond Street in Waltham near Boston and got Ray Tabano in to start up their merchandising operation, printing and selling T-shirts. Everyone they trusted, from their management down through the system to the guys packing the T-shirts, was systematically ripping them off. If nothing else, it was a sure sign of success. And there was a reoccurring problem. Alyssa and Joe were becoming ever more arrogant and remote. Stephen had lost much of his contact with Joe, who was his drink and drug buddy, his writing partner and his soul brother. But to confront Joe about it might precipitate his leaving the band. On the 5th of August 1975, Joe and Alyssa were married at the Ritz Hotel in Boston. By the end of the month, Toys in the Attic had reached number 11 on the Billboard chart, and Sweet Emotion, released 4 months earlier in May, was a top 40 hit. But they didn't rest on their laurels, and early in 1976 they backed the Record Plant Mobile Studio up to The Warehouse and began work on Rocks, their 4th album.
The Aerosmith without Joe and without Brad was okay. It's a good band. Great album too. I'm real proud of it. I love it.
Rocks was released in May 1976. By the 21st of the month, it was at number 3 and stayed on the chart for a year. On May the 10th, Aerosmith played Madison Square Gardens, a landmark venue for any band. They were hitting the big time. Stephen had bought an old yacht club at Lake Sunapee and was waiting for it to be renovated. All the band members were beginning to live like millionaire rock stars, and Porsches and Ferraris began to fill their driveways. They now had a hit album, their own mini airline, Aeroforce, and more money and drugs than they knew what to do with. But by this time, Joe had started using heroin, and relations within the band were strained. When Stephen's girlfriend, Diana, became pregnant, instead of being overjoyed, his first reaction was to ask her to have an abortion. She went ahead with it, but their relationship ended soon afterwards. Next he took up with a former model named Bibi Buell, and in time she too became pregnant, but this time the pregnancy went ahead, and she gave birth to their daughter Liv, who later became an actress under the name Liv Tyler. But Bibi was unable to take the hectic, almost suicidal pace of the band's adventures in hedonism and returned to her former partner, eccentric art rocker Todd Rundgren, with whom she brought up Liv. After Bibi came Serinda Fox, whose real name was Kathleen Hetzikian. When Stephen met her, she was with David Johansen of the New York Dolls. She also became pregnant, and this time Stephen decided it was time to get married. She bore him another daughter before that relationship too ended in tears. In October 1976, Aerosmith toured Europe for the first time. They had a less than rapturous reception in London and varying degrees of success elsewhere. A few months later, however, early in 1977, they played at the Budokan Martial Arts Center in Japan and were treated like gods. From there they flew on February the 10th to Maui in Hawaii to begin pre-production on their next album. For the recording, they chose a large country estate called the Senecal in Westchester County near New York. Ironically enough, it had been most recently used as a convent, but when Aerosmith hired it, its new owner was intending to turn it into a treatment centre for disturbed adolescents. He got Aerosmith instead. The band came straight off the road and into the specially built studio with no rest, no carefully devised plan, and no songs. Each band member chose a suite of rooms to live in, and once there, they began to fall into mutual suspicion and loathing. Joe and Alyssa retreated to their rooms, often for days on end. Stephen was holed up in his own private world, and the others, who now refer to themselves as the less interesting three, kept to theirs. There was the usual tension between Joe and Alyssa and the rest of the band, and much of the time was spent with their guns, cars and motorcycles. Bad behaviour was rife, with the two frontmen treating the rhythm section with haughty disdain, appearing to play their parts with a complete lack of enthusiasm or not at all. Into this unhealthy atmosphere came Jack Douglas, whose job it was to piece together a coherent album from the material presented by the band. The results were patchy. They were all exhausted, and psychotic incidents were commonplace. It became increasingly obvious that the formula was tired and the old magic was proving to be elusive. To make matters worse, Joe was now withholding ideas from the band, making a distinction between his songs and theirs. They had now become, in Joe Perry's words, drug addicts dabbling in music, rather than musicians dabbling in drugs. After the initial recording sessions, they embarked on a lengthy world tour, stopping off in August to play the Reading Festival to mixed response. Stephen was now working so hard that he began to experience drug-induced seizures, and occasionally he collapsed on stage. Draw the Line was released in December 1977, selling 1.5 million copies in its first few weeks, but stalling on the chart at number 11. By then the band had stopped touring, and there were no live appearances to give the record that extra push to get it into the top 10. In 1978, Aerosmith decided that the arena gigs they were used to playing had become too grandiose, and so played a few dates in small clubs billed as Dr. J. Jones and the Interns, perhaps inspired by the Sex Pistols' contention that too many bands had distanced themselves from their audience. They hired a young musician named Mark Radis to play keyboards and to help out with the harmonies. He joined them throughout the Draw the Line tour, but kept himself to himself, which, in retrospect, was probably just as well. By contrast with the club gigs, they also played at Cal Jam, a huge outdoor concert at Ontario Motor Speedway in Los Angeles before a crowd of 350,000, at that time the largest event of its kind. In the spring of 1978, they began work on Robert Stigwood's embarrassingly awful film of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, starring the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton. The only positive part of the project was that they got to record Come Together with George Martin. Afterwards, they began to assemble tracks for a double live album, the late 70s cliché that had become standard practice for all big-name bands. This would eventually become Live Bootleg, released in November 1978, reaching number 13 in the charts. But tensions between the band had reached a critical state, and during the recording of their 7th album, Night in the Ruts, in 1979, Joe Perry quit the band. Officially, he had left to pursue a solo career. Unofficially, he and Stephen had got to the point that they wanted to kill each other. The album was finished with guitarist Jimmy Crespo augmenting the parts Joe had already recorded, aided by Richie Super, a friend of Stephen's. Aerosmith regrouped and began to consider their future. Even though Joe's absence was felt by all, the show had to go on. Night in the Ruts had had a critical mauling, and morale was low. With Jimmy Crespo now a full-time band member, the shows did go on, with many loyal fans giving him standing ovations. But by now, Stephen was in and out of drug rehab units, having collapsed once too often, and his relationship with Surinder was rapidly deteriorating. Though Jimmy Crespo worked hard during his time with Aerosmith, it was felt by all that the band was collapsing in on itself, and something was bound to give. Then, in September 1981, Brad Whitford decided that he too had had enough.
After 3 years of us trying to make it without Joe and Brad, and after 3 years of Brad and Joe trying to make it separately, trying to recapture what we had with Aerosmith, we finally all realized that that united we stand, divided we fall. And that's exactly what happened.
Joe's new band, the Joe Perry Project, recorded 3 albums during its brief but glorious life. The records were well received critically, despite the fact that the first 2 were given no push at all by Columbia, who wanted Joe back in Aerosmith so that business could be resumed as usual. The final album was released on Joe's new label, MCA, but failed to make any real impression on a world secretly hoping that Aerosmith would reform. But it would be almost 2 years before the next Aerosmith album was released. Rick Dufay, a friend of producer Jack Douglas, was brought in to replace Brad Whitford, and the result, Rock in a Hard Place, released in August 1982, continued the precedent set by Night in the Ruts. Though not terrible, it lacked the essential sparkle that the Steven Tyler-Joe Perry writing relationship brought to the band. By now, Joe had a manager, Tim Collins, and was hoping that the project would finally be able to realise its full potential. But it became obvious that while he was with Alyssa, things were going badly wrong in all areas of his life, and in 1982 he decided to leave her. Brad Whitford had also tried his luck with a solo career, recording an album, Whitford St Holmes, recorded with Derek St Holmes from Ted Nugent's band. The album failed to chart, leaving Brad with no band, no job, and hard times looming ahead. Stephen's relationship with Surinder had now finished, and he would soon meet the woman who would later become his long-term wife, Teresa. She was to bring some much-needed stability to his life, essential for the difficult years that lay ahead. In 1983, the world of rock music was a changed place. Aerosmith had been the champions of the underdog, but the Blue Denim Army that had supported them, and bands like them through the drab 1970s, had been demobilised. This was now the era of conspicuous consumerism, MTV and celebrity fitness videos. MTV had replaced FM radio as the most effective marketing tool for a band's new album or single. Without a video, you were marginalised, and the competition was intense. It was a difficult time for those raised on the macho rock ethic of the old school. Women were no longer old ladies. It was uncool to be so bombed you could hardly play, and hip-hop was soon to replace rock as the industry's most influential genre. Suddenly, Aerosmith didn't fit anymore, and their appetite for destruction was eating them alive. They had started with nothing, worked 25 hours a day, 8 days a week, to get to the top, and then had lost the plot. Now the world no longer cared. In the project, Joe Perry was able to live the life he had been denied by his relationship with the bossy, controlling Alyssa. He had become, as Steven told him, pussy-whipped. Now, free of both Alyssa and Aerosmith, he could let go. The 2 things in his life that should have been the most liberating had become the most oppressive. But after this symbolic period of release, he had to face the fact that his first love was Aerosmith. He had to go back and put things right with Steven. In the spring of 1983, he and Tim Collins were invited to Aerosmith's homecoming show at the Worcester Centrum Arena in Boston, an important gig for the band. Joe grabbed Steven and they disappeared together into the dressing room. Joe had some heroin he had scored from Surinder, and as a consequence of this session, Steven collapsed on stage and the concert was abandoned. In the resulting hysteria, everyone blamed Joe and Brad Whitford, who had dropped by to see how things were going without him, found himself thinking, thank God I'm no longer part of this. Unfortunately, it was exactly this kind of psychodrama that Aerosmith thrived on, and it was also the demon tearing them apart. If there was going to be an Aerosmith in the future, some kind of drastic measure was called for. In psychology, that process is called intervention. In the meantime, Joe was struggling to make the project succeed as he was broke. Into his life now came a new love, a woman whose first husband had once told her to beware of bands with logos. Billy Montgomery had never heard of Aerosmith and wondered why this guy, who had his own band called the Joe Perry Project, was having such a hard time trying to make it. But it now occurred to Joe that with Alyssa gone, there was no reason not to go back to Aerosmith. Stephen was seeing the world change, the lawyers and accountants replacing the old guard like Frank Connolly, a world fast disappearing. Hitting out against these inevitable transitions, he snorted up his nose, his private jet, his house, his car and his clothes. He was now down to the $20 a day meted out to him by his managers. For the others, it was the same. Their money drained away by mortgages and alimony payments. Brad's marriage to his wife, Laurie, had collapsed, and he was now with his new partner, Karen. Tom Hamilton was still with Terry, and Joey Kramer with his wife, April, but the fall from grace affected them too. Nobody could see how it had all gone so horribly wrong. The band's gigs had been shrinking in size, and now even the club dates were seldom fully booked. In the wake of all this soul-searching, it emerged that their managers too had lost their way, and when Joe and Stephen agreed to start afresh, Joe insisted that Tim Collins become their manager. And so it was agreed. It was to be the dawn of a new era, a fresh, clean Aerosmith in a brave new world of sobriety.
All of us were involved in some pretty heavy partying, some of us more than others, obviously. That screws up your judgment. So here we were, burned out from the road, burned out from trying to get the record together. The record wasn't working yet. Add in the chemical problem, and you can see why things split apart.
In 1974, David Krebs had negotiated a deal with Walter Letnikoff, who'd agreed that after 20 years, Aerosmith's management company would regain the rights to the band's original master recordings, believing that by 1994 they would be history. So it was that in 1984, the Joe Perry Project was disbanded. Jimmy Crespo and Rick Dufay were thanked and told goodbye, and Aerosmith went back on the road for the Back in the Saddle tour, designed to bring in some much-needed cash. They now had no record deal and needed to get rid of their managers, Steve Lieber and David Krebs. After much wrangling, Tim Collins took their place. Columbia had decided they didn't need a bunch of aging heroin addicts on their roster, and Collins began negotiations with John Calladner from Geffen Records, who didn't drink, didn't do drugs, and who was one of the few people in the business who said what he meant. But if things were going to work out, there was a lot of growing up to do. Joey Kramer read in Billboard magazine that the Back in the Saddle tour grossed $5 million and demanded $1 million as his share. Tim Collins had to patiently explain to him that certain legitimate deductions had to be made and that there were other people to pay. After all these years, the band seemed ignorant of how the business worked. In 1985, Aerosmith began work on their 7th studio album, Done with Mirrors, produced by veteran stadium rock producer Ted Templeman, who had made winning albums with the Doobie Brothers, Little Feat, Van Halen and Montrose. It was released in December 1985 and did poor business. Clearly, there was more work to do to get the band back where they should be, at the top of their class. Joe Perry and Billy Montgomery were married in January 1986. It was also the year that would see Aerosmith pull off their most significant recording of that period, their collaboration with rap act Run DMC. At the suggestion of Rick Rubin, the genius kid from nowhere, who had made millions selling hip-hop to white suburban kids, Joe and Stephen were booked into Magic Ventures' studio in Manhattan on May the 9th, 1986. Run DMC, who in real life were Joseph Run Simmons, Daryl DMC McDaniels, and Jason Jam Master J Missile, were three rappers from Queens in New York who used Walk This Way as the basis for work of their own. They thought the song was by a band called Toys in the Attic. At the recording, all went well, and Joe and Stephen got a taste of how the world of the mid-1980s worked. Run DMC were keen to get the recording over with quickly because they had to return their hired car to the garage by 6 o'clock. During a break, the three rappers huddled in a corner, intent on doing something that Joe and Stephen were convinced was crack. In fact, they were eating their lunch from bags from McDonald's. 2 weeks later, they shot a video in which both Run DMC and Aerosmith are playing the song in adjacent halls. Each is trying to get the other to turn down, and the wall dividing them is smashed to reveal that all that really divides them is racism. It was a poignant message. The single reached number 8 and gave Aerosmith access to contemporary hit radio and MTV. Now, for a change, the band was cool. But it also became obvious that drastic action was needed to save them from their addictions. And Tim Collins organised an intervention to be done on Stephen by the other 4 band members, with a psychiatrist, Dr. Lou Cox, in attendance. So Stephen became the first of the toxic twins to be detoxed. Each band member had written down a list of grievances. Stephen, on such a date, you did this, you said that, you did the other thing, and it really pissed me off. This went on for hours. Stephen was told to clean up or die, and to do it now, right away. Once he had accepted that it had to happen, he naturally demanded that the others did the same. And so Aerosmith, formerly America's most wasted rock band, cleaned up. A new era had finally begun, and now they were ready to take back their crown and to set out to climb to the top of the pile again.
It's not very satisfying to work hard on a record or work hard on a tour and not have people know who you are and know what you did. You know, if I didn't care about recognition, I'd go play my bass in my closet.
The new Aerosmith came into the bright light of day, like blind men whose sight has been restored. Done with Mirrors had not been an unqualified disaster, but it was clear that a new working method was needed. Producer Ted Templeman was replaced by Bruce Fairbairn, who had achieved major success with Bon Jovi's blockbuster album Slippery When Wet. Rock was no longer a club for awkward teenage boys. It was a fully paid-up member of a global entertainment industry. It was also clear to John Kalodner, whose job it was to mastermind the recording of the new record, which would become Permanent Vacation, that the band was at that time not capable of producing the kind of pop-tinged crossover hits that the market would demand. And so, for the first time, professional songwriters were drafted in to assist in the crucial process of getting new songs together. In January 1987, writer Desmond Childs, who also worked on Slippery When Wet, was brought in to work with Joe and Stephen, a collaboration which produced Dude, Angel and Heart's Done Time. Later that year, they teamed up with Jim Vallance, best known for his work with Bryan Adams, to write Magic Touch, Samurai and Hangman Jury, based on a Lead Belly original called Lining Track. Finally, Holly Knight, who worked with Hart and Pat Benatar, was brought in to finish a song Stephen had called Ragtime, turning it into Ragdoll. Naturally, there was much protesting and soul-searching, but the ruse worked. So, by ditching their hold on the past, they reinvented themselves. Permanent Vacation, released in August 1987, became their best-selling album to date. With a series of stunning videos, they showed the world that they were back on top, and this time they were staying there. Their mantra had become, "Don't bore us, get to the chorus," an acknowledgement that what the world wanted now was snappy pop songs and not the tedious 90-minute wig-out guitar solos that had characterised rock in the previous decade. With St. John and Hangman Jury, they produced two cuts that retained their roots in the blues, but which were firmly grounded in the contemporary idiom, and with The Movie, they showed a new side to their art, with a moody instrumental. Later that same year, Stephen divorced Surinder, and interventions were made on Joey Kramer and Tom Hamilton, who had yet to make a definitive commitment to sobriety.
Just because we got sober doesn't mean we're still not junkies and drug addicts and alcoholics. You go to AA meetings and Narcotics Anonymous meetings down my street, and you walk in and it's a room full of junkies. Just because they're not shooting up doesn't mean they don't change. You're still the way you are.
Through the latter half of 1987 and into 1988, Aerosmith took Permanent Vacation on the road, playing a total of 160 concerts in North America, Canada, and then down to the West Coast to California. On May the 29th, Stephen married Teresa, and their daughter, Chelsea Tallarico, was born in Boston in 1989. For the summer shows, they were supported by Guns N' Roses, who had taken the Aerosmith template and made it their own. At first, it seemed that the pairing would be disastrous, as Guns N' Roses were not noted for their clean living. But most of the dates were a success, though Stephen had to tell the band that if they brought drugs into his dressing room, he would leave. Permanent Vacation had sold 4 million copies by October 1988, and it was a hit in both Europe and Japan, revitalising the band's profile globally. By 1989, they were back on form, writing songs they knew would prove to be Aerosmith classics. The album Pump provided proof that they could experiment and still retain their audience. And with Janie's Got a Gun, a song about child abuse, they won their first Grammy. All 5 members were now clean, and it showed. Pump rocked like no other album, theirs or anyone else's. With Bruce Fairbairn producing again, the sound was lean and tight, a natural contender for the sound that would dominate the 1990s. As grunge came around and Kurt Cobain showed to be fucked up is okay up to a point, beyond that point it's disaster. Aerosmith were now middle-aged entertainers, no longer wild young things living out their dream of taking on the world. They were family men with wives and children. Pump was released in September 1989 and was a smash. David Fincher, shortly to make the third Alien film and eventually Seven, starring Brad Pitt, made a short film for Janie that rewrote the rules of pop video production. The band was now in a position to take on other commitments, more for fun than for any specific advantage, including a stint on Wayne's World, which led to an appearance in the second film. In 1993, they recorded an MTV Unplugged concert, and later played for MTV Europe for the first time. They'd had a greatest hits album, 2 albums of live performances, another hits package with gems, and a box set released by Columbia called Pandora's Box, which featured unreleased and live tracks. The Aerosmith industry was as strong as ever. Pump had sold 8 million copies when they returned to the recording studios to start on their next album, which was to be called Get a Grip. Once again, there were qualms at Geffen about the quality of the songs, and collaborators helped to polish the work already done. A second producer, Brendan O'Brien, who had worked with the Black Crowes, was brought in to remix the work done by Bruce Fairbairn. brimming with excitement, the album was another hit, containing Living on the Edge, a song about the beating given to Rodney King by racist police, a tribute to Fleetwood Mac's great guitarist Peter Green, and a single that almost killed the record, Eat the Rich. Released in April 1993, the album went on to sell 8 million copies worldwide. Yet, despite all this very respectable action, there were still problems. Tim Collins insisted that any new dysfunctional tendencies be met with stints in therapy, so band members were forced to go because they liked sex too much or wanted to spend a large amount of money. It began to wear them down, and it was becoming clear that it was now Tim Collins that had the problem. He was becoming a control freak. In February 1995, they inducted Led Zeppelin into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and for the next 18 months they recorded and then re-recorded their first album for Sony, 9 Lives. During this time, they finally had to face the fact that they could no longer go on with Tim Collins, now in a calamitous depression as their manager. Their new album sold 4 million copies in its first year. Aerosmith were now apparently unstoppable.
You know, it's too much. It's fucking much. There's so much magic and shit going on stage. It's unbelievable. So much talent and so much fucking good old rock and roll happening up there, and the audience is going ape shit, and we love it.
By the year 2001, Aerosmith were back in the saddle again, this time with an album, Just Push Play, produced by Stephen and Joe, done in their own way and without outside interference. Now in his 50s, Steven Tyler resembles more than ever the glamorous stick insect that the Times described him as all those years ago. The band look healthy, as if they are enjoying themselves. They have acquired a new fan base of young kids, who are in many cases even younger than their own children, but still manage to retain many of their original followers. They had helped bring the music made by their idols to the world in a fresh and honest way. They had made themselves rich men, had then seen all their wealth taken away, and had then won it all back. Into their 4th decade, they seem as popular as ever, and the glorious, compelling soap opera continues, watched by millions the world over. Ladies and gentlemen, the world's greatest rock band, Aerosmith.
Thanks for buying Maximum Aerosmith. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch out for further titles on Chrome Dreams coming up soon. If you did enjoy it or have any comments or suggestions, write to us at Chrome Dreams, PO Box 230, New Malden, Surrey, UK, KT36YY, or email on mail@chromedreams.co.uk. Details of our full catalogue are listed on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk. Thanks again for listening, and goodbye for now.